Hey class, this is for our fourth unit for American literature. We're going to be focusing on our first novel for the entire semester, Dorothy Hughes' In a Lonely Place. All right, this novel has been out since the late 40s, so there's a whole bunch of printings of it. You can absolutely find them. There's also a very famous film noir adaptation of this, but I will warn you that the film version of it differs extremely in some very crucial facts from the novel. So if you watch the film version but don't read the book, it's an entirely different story almost. Namely, whether or not the killer is innocent or guilty, right? Which is a big deal, right? So I would definitely suggest to stick to the book. It is an easy read, okay? It's simple, kind of pulpy, but not really. Very noir detective. It's only 200 pages. Right? You got 2 weeks to get through it, right? This is an airplane read as far as I'm concerned. You can just gun through this pretty quickly, right? We're going to talk about a couple contextual things about the novel that I want you guys to keep in mind, and some general things I want you to pay attention to during, okay? Some upfront stuff, right? Obviously, this is a crime story. There's murders and stuff involved, right? And it's also what we would call a noir, right? You're going to see things that feel very like on the nose for the noir, right? Like the main character's name is Dick Steele, right? You know, like, and the names are very on point for like an intense noir story. But again, this is published in the late 40s, just post World War II. Okay. So it's not that it's cliche, it's on the forefront of these things that eventually became very obvious, okay? There are aspects of this that are very important for us to keep in context that I note on a couple things, namely historical context, okay? We are just post-World War II for this novel, right? Taking place in Los Angeles. There's a lot that takes place in this novel that makes sense geographically if you understand what Los Angeles looks like, right, and how it's laid out, right? So if you've been there, you're familiar with it, you'll notice that things make sense where characters are going, right? If not, it's not an especially big hurdle to not know them, but it's a neat thing to actually understand. This being post-World War II, it's pretty interesting. I think it puts this book in conversation actually with a lot of the British modernists that came right after World War I, right? So you have people like Virginia Woolf writing a novel called Mrs. Dalloway, which talks about something that I think this novel deals with a lot, which is someone coming back from the war damaged, right? Now, I would argue in Mrs. Dalloway, we're supposed to feel bad for the person who comes back damaged. Probably not for In a Lonely Place, right? And then it's a good, interesting thing I'd like you to think about to go back and forth on. Did the war damage the killer in this novel, or did it just uncover an aspect of them, right? Are they a result of the trauma, or did the trauma just reveal their true colors, right? These are questions for the ages, right? But I think it's an interesting thing to consider how you feel about it as you move through this. But we're in post-World War Los Angeles. We have a whole bunch of men who have come back from war to a society that, unlike today, right, and even now we have trouble kind of reacclimating our wartime veterans into society, right? But we understand that PTSD is a thing, right? Even as an instructor, I go through things to make sure that my veteran students have specific accommodations and awareness of traumas or traits that they might have picked up via their time serving abroad, right? So we didn't understand that, right? There was like shell shock, which was the idea from World War I, the idea that you would just, something was wrong with you after you went through a rough battle, right? It's like, okay, we understand that there's a whole bunch of levels to that now, and PTSD takes many forms, but we didn't understand any of that. Psychology wasn't in the exact place to conceptualize these things at the time, okay? So keep that in mind as you go through this, that there are plenty of people in this book that are exposed and or potentially tinted in some way by exposure to violence, right? and what that does to a number of characters in this book. Okay. Also interesting to conceptualize is what the war would have done to the place of the woman or the female back home, right? Remember that coming off of World War II, we had Rosie the Riveter and everything. Women moved into the manufacturing space and into the workplace in force during the war in order to support it while men were sent abroad for the most part, right? What's fascinating about this is when they came home, right, these women were now sent home, right, and said, okay, you must give these jobs back to these men, right, and they are sent home, right? Obviously, this leads to a great push for women's rights and women's suffrage, right, because women have demonstrated they can do these things. So you can't just say that it's not a woman's work anymore when it's been proven to have been, right? So that ridiculous justification beforehand is immediately thrown out the window by practical application, right? But now you have women who have been in society given agency that they have not previously had in American society, who are now pushed back to the side, right, and told to move back into the domestic, move back into just the spousal role, right? But they have a level of autonomy and agency and familiarity between them that is new, right, and changes how they are empowered to interact with the world, and it's going forward from this time period, right? But further than that, I think there's also a level of the fact that the marginalized can recognize the oppressor, right? So I think an interesting essay companion that we've talked about before is the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house, right? Compare that to how the female has to act in this, right? How the feminine is forced to play its part, right? The woman is preyed on, but is also crucial to the resolution of this novel, right? And that as this kind of oppressed group in society, right, women recognize not just the male as an oppressor, right, but also particularly the predatory man, right? I assure you that for most people, but especially those amongst you who are femme-presenting, right, or anything of the sort, or can consider themselves in any of these intersectionalities to belong to essentially a marginalized or an oppressed group, right? You know what it means to have that vibe about someone, right? That something's not right with this person. I don't think I've met a cis or trans woman who doesn't understand what it means to be around that guy who you immediately don't feel comfortable around, right? Besides that, right, you also have, for example, if we consider just queerness as one of these things, like I understand what it's around like, and you immediately get the vibe off someone who, without saying anything, makes it very apparent to you that they have an issue with who you are, right? And it can be queerness, it could be gender, it could be race, right? And it takes it a step further to, I understand that if this person was alone with me, I think they would be able to harm me or inclined to harm me, right? The inherent ability to recognize the most violent of our oppressors, right, is a crucial part of this book, right? So I believe you guys will have a really interesting time trying to piece together how that's working, right? Other things to consider, right? This book takes place from an interesting narrator perspective. Consider how much we can trust what this narrator says coming to when we come to understand what we do about them, okay? Can we trust their account of events or their descriptions of characters, right? What does that change for you about the rest of the story? Do you have difficulty or more ease with finding sympathy with certain characters because of how this character reacts to them, right? Keep those things in mind, right? Generally speaking, despite the fact that we know what we know about the narrator pretty early on, right? There is a mystery inherent in this book about why this character is how they are, right? And then there's also a general amount of suspense because for most of the book, we know much more than the other characters who are trying to solve the mystery, right? And it makes us tense because we're worried for characters, okay? Suspense is all about that, right? Like the idea that you know more than than the characters, so you can worry about things that they have no reason to know about, okay? Another thing to consider, this novel has a fantastic breakdown of the psychology of a sociopathic serial killer, okay? I think it ties brilliantly into the idea of the victim can recognize the predator, right? Or the oppressed recognizes the oppressor, right? And it's interesting to put that in context of the fact that like the kind of like rock steady appearance of the serial killer in that pathology comes in the 70s, and how much of this was just kind of an understood type of individual by particular communities, right? Or intersectional identities like women, queer groups, people of color, etc. Versus, right, when it becomes accepted by kind of like the mainstream academic, right? Like the white, the straight, the male, right? Kind of exemplified most prominently in the 70s by the FBI, which is what dives into this so much, right? You can kind of get a fictionalized but still interesting look at the process of how they put all that together. Go watch Mindhunter on Netflix. It's a good show, right? But read this first and then go watch that and watch them be like, we have figured out this thing about serial killers, and then be like, but Dorothy Hughes pointed out exactly how this person did things and was thinking way back in the 40s, right? So was this really new information, or was this information that was just pushed out of the mainstream, right? The permissions, the ability to voice these realities is very much what we've been discussing this semester, okay? Some general housekeeping on the back of that. I have my comprehensive exams the last 2 weeks of this October, so I will be hard to get a hold of, right? I'm going to schedule us to be able to have in-person meetings next week, right? If you guys want to have them, I'll be scheduling the Tuesday and the Thursday open for those, and I'll be doing a spate of grading this weekend. This weekend you will also have your first spanning assignment go up. It'll be a couple options you get to pick from for essays. And then besides that, I'll have recorded the next lecture probably this weekend, but it'll be for obviously 2 weeks out from now, just so that it's up and ready to go when you guys get to it at your leisure. Like I said, this is pretty short, so if you want to get ahead on that one, I don't blame you. All right. Hope you had a good time with the Reading Queer Anthology. Super fun, right? And I was really excited to expose you guys to a number of poets that I think would be fascinating for you guys to dive into. Okay. One last note, as kind of a stylistic thing, my edition of this has an afterword, right, i.e. something at the very end of the book, written by Megan Abbott, right? If you don't get this edition, that's fine. Try to find the afterword. It's actually very helpful, but read it after the book, right? Just to get some extra context, okay? With that being said, enjoy the novel. It's the most straightforward thing we're going to be reading for the rest of the semester in terms of form. It's just a novel, right? And then we will... I'll see you guys in the discussion boards, which should already be up, and we'll unpack some interesting ideas about this before we move on to the next unit. All right, stay safe. Very proud of you guys. The discussion boards you guys have been putting in have been fantastic. All right, so just keep up the good work. You guys are doing great, and I'll see you guys for the next lecture.